Something felt wrong the moment that passage was read aloud. So wrong that the entire room froze. Cameras stopped panning, and even lawmakers who love turning every moment into a soundbite went dead quiet. Because once those words hit the air, everyone suddenly realized this wasn't a political jab, a partisan moment, or some contrived headline-grabbing stunt. It was something far more unsettling. A confession, a window into someone's instincts, and a question nobody wanted to ask out loud. If this is how she handled a frightened 14-month-old puppy, what does that mean for the judgment she uses in positions of real power? That's where everything begins. Not with outrage, not with spin, but with a story written by the person herself. A story that suddenly reads very differently when placed in the hands of Congress during a high-stakes debate.
Noem's dog as a dog, but actually it was a puppy. It was 14 months old. And that puppy had a name. Say its name. Cricket. Okay, that puppy had a name. And so if you had a couple moments, I would now like to do a spirited reading from the book by our Secretary of Homeland Security. It starts, "I hated that dog. On the way home from a hunt, the dog on the way home from a pheasant hunt was untrainable, and it went to go attack the chickens. And at that moment, I realized I had to put her down. So I grabbed a gun and led Cricket to a gravel pit. Wasn't a pleasant job, but it had to be done. And after it was over, I realized another unpleasant job needed to be done. And so I went and got the family goat and brought that to the gravel pit. And unfortunately, I wasn't able to kill that goat with one shot." So anyway, I think the point of bringing it up is, on the merits of the bill, we can debate the merits of the bill. But if we're just going to get on our high horse about animal cruelty, which I think we all agree on, by the way, I think there's unanimity here on animal cruelty. I just, want to make sure that we apply that universally. And I think that's what the gentleman from New York is just trying to remind our colleagues, who we have not seen in a while, that, the Secretary of Homeland Security also did not treat an animal in which we believe the animal should be treated. And with that, I'll yield if Mr. Raskin has any questions.
Well, welcome back, Mr. Moskowitz. And first of all, I think your reference to goats is completely immaterial to what we're discussing today. It's not part of the bill. Isn't that right?
There are no goats in the bill. I was meaning, not me, and she wrote this in the book, that after she shot the dog, she's like, "That was awesome, go get the goat." So.
All right, well, getting back to the substance of it, whether it's a magnificent dog like Freddie, who joins us today, or Cricket, whose reputation has obviously been besmirched by the Secretary of Homeland Security, all dogs deserve not to be treated in a cruel and capricious way. But the point here is that everything that anybody in this room would have wanted to happen happened in this case. Right after the culprit kicked Freddie, the culprit was apprehended, was arrested, was charged, and spent 3 days in jail before being removed and deported from the country. So one asks, other than the opportunity to say we agree with what happened, what are we doing here? All that's really happening is that the majority is using it as an opportunity to try to dilute this standard that is working perfectly well, which is that if you are actually convicted of such an offense, then you will be immediately removable and deportable from the country. And there's no reason to puncture that basic line, as Mr. Nadler says, in our jurisprudence. And I can't see why any of us would want to go down that road. I thank you for reminding us that animal cruelty is a serious problem across the country, Mr. Moskowitz and Mr. Goldman. And I do hope that we can all agree that what happened in this case is precisely what should have happened. We don't need to be tampering with the law at this point. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Arizona is recognized. Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. On this particular amendment, maybe we should amend this amendment to call it the Sri Thandadar bill. And so with that, I think this particular interesting article here is from the UK Daily Mail. Democratic congressman trying to impeach President Trump has been accused of abandoning over 100 dogs to starve after his company cruelly tested pharmaceuticals on them. Sri Thandadar was behind a testing lab that shut down in 2010. Months after the New Jersey lab closed, local animal rights activists alerted authorities to 118 beagles that had been left behind locked in the facility. At the time, the lab's ex-workers told USA Today they had been jumping fences at the facility to provide food and water for the dogs. Insiders claimed that even before the dogs were abandoned to starve, they had lived horrific lives in captivity and were subject to toxicology tests. I don't think they've actually had their paws on the grass. When I walked in here, it looked like they were walking on eggshells. They were kind of afraid to walk on the grass. The point is, and so, Mr. Chairman, I submit for the record this article from UK Daily Mail entitled "Dem Congressman Sri Thandadar famed for railing against Trump carried out unspeakable acts against 118 beagles."
Without objection.
And by the way, California-based organization Defense of Animals then went back to the same site and saved 55 long-tailed macaque monkeys as well. The point is, you're trying to make a joke out of something, and the reality is what happened should not have happened, and when you try to minimize something that's serious, sometimes your humor is not really funny. It's flat. And so if we're going to invoke names here, then I would invoke the name of your own colleague, Sri Thandadar. With that,
Would the gentleman yield?
I'll yield to the gentleman from California.
Perhaps the gentleman would consider modifying his suggestion by adding the name of Anthony Fauci, who's alleged to have presided over the torture of many more beagles and other harmless creatures, all in the name of perverted science.
Will the gentleman yield?
I would be happy to include that amendment. So Mr. Chairman, I'm making an oral amendment to change the title of the article of the underlying bill.
Without objection.
Will the gentleman yield for a question?
No.
Okay. That's totally fine.
I'm going to object to that.
Okay. There's an objection raised to the amendment offered to the amendment. All those in, we can take a roll call on all those in favor. All the,
Who seeks recognition? Who seeks recognition?
but I want.
He objected.
Have you yielded back? Is the gentleman yielded back?
Yeah.
All right. Who seeks recognition? The gentleman from Tennessee seeks recognition. Your gentleman's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I am a major animal rights,
Why can't we?
animal protection legislator for 40 years. I'll have a tie on.
Because the moment Representative Jared Moskowitz opened that book and began reading those sentences verbatim, the political masks dropped. The performative smiles faded. And lawmakers realized that the room was no longer debating policy. They were confronting character. Moskowitz didn't add drama. He didn't exaggerate. He didn't twist a single detail. He didn't need to. The words were disturbing enough on their own, he read. I hated that dog on the way home from a hunt. A dog, except, as he emphasized, it wasn't actually a dog. It was a puppy. A 14-month-old puppy named Cricket, who, according to the story, struggled during a hunt and later went after some chickens. And instead of training, instead of patience, instead of anything resembling humane understanding, the author described leading that puppy to a gravel pit and shooting it. Not years later. Not with distance. Not reluctantly. But as a matter-of-fact decision. Something that had to be done. And as soon as the last word of that sentence left his mouth, you could feel the oxygen disappear from the room. But it didn't stop there. Because then came the part no one expected him to read. The part that even people familiar with the book tend to forget. The part that makes the story spiral into something even darker and harder to comprehend. After shooting the puppy, the author went back to get the family goat and shot that, too. Not cleanly, not quickly, but over multiple attempts. in a scene so unsettling that even Moskowitz hesitated before continuing, as if giving the room a chance to brace for impact. And yet he still pushed forward, because the point he was making wasn't about theatrics. It was about judgment, consistency, responsibility. The way someone responds when faced with something that isn't easy, perfect, or convenient. As he read, every lawmaker, left, right, and everything in between, was forced to confront the reality that these weren't accusations. These were admissions. This wasn't some political opponent digging for dirt. This was someone publicly outlining a worldview in their own handwriting, seemingly unaware of how unsettling it would sound to the world outside their bubble. And that's when the real tension entered the room, because the hearing wasn't about dogs. It wasn't about goats. It wasn't about farm life. It wasn't even about the book. The hearing was about federal authority, removal standards, and how far government enforcement powers should reach. It was about giving more discretion, more judgment, more unilateral decision-making power to someone who had once decided that the right answer to a difficult, misbehaving puppy was a trip to a gravel pit. That's why Moskowitz read the passage, not to shame, not to grandstand, but to ask a question that absolutely needed to be asked. What does someone's instinctive solution reveal about how they would wield power over millions of people? That was the heart of the moment, and exactly why the room grew uneasy. You could see it in the shifting bodies, in the lawmakers who suddenly avoided eye contact, in the uncomfortable smirks that weren't really smirks at all. Some tried to redirect. Some tried to insist the story was irrelevant. Some, like Representative Raskin, attempted to bring the conversation back to legal standards. But even he couldn't dismiss the weight of what had just happened. Because here's the truth. When the person responsible for national security, border authority, and federal enforcement writes a story about how shooting a young animal felt like the necessary and even satisfying solution to a frustrating moment, that story becomes relevant. Deeply relevant. Not because of cruelty, but because of temperament, impulse control, decision-making under pressure, the very qualities that determine how someone handles power, and everyone in that hearing knew it. That's what made the silence haunting. That's what made Moskowitz's reading so powerful. He didn't embellish. He didn't add emotion. He didn't twist anything. He simply held up a mirror, and the reflection wasn't flattering, because beyond the shock factor, beyond the weirdness of how casually the goat incident was described, beyond the disturbing tone, it raised a deeper issue. Why include this story in a book at all? What message was it meant to convey? What kind of leadership was being modeled? Online, there has long been speculation, unverified, but widespread, that the author believed the story showed toughness or decisiveness. But if that was the intention, the reaction shows it backfired spectacularly. Most readers didn't interpret the story as strength. They interpreted it as impulsive, unbalanced, and deeply unsettling. And when you place that type of decision-making next to the authority someone now holds, the meaning shifts again. What once seemed like a controversial anecdote suddenly becomes a case study in judgment. That is why the clip went viral, because the hearing exposed a double standard that has existed for far too long. Outrage that appears only when it is politically useful, silence when it is politically inconvenient. Lawmakers who would have screamed for days if a rival had written the same passage suddenly stumbled over their own talking points, unwilling to condemn something that any ordinary person would recognize as disturbing. And Moskowitz, whether people agree with him or not, didn't let that slide. He forced the room to sit with the discomfort. He forced the narrative back to accountability. He forced everyone to confront the fact that leadership isn't just about policies. It's about values. The moment the story was read aloud, all the excuses evaporated. All the political shielding cracked. Suddenly, the conversation wasn't about immigration statutes. It wasn't about amendments. It wasn't about procedure. It was about character, consistency, and the very thing Congress is supposed to evaluate, whether the people with power are emotionally and ethically suited to wield it. And that cuts deeper than any headline. That's why this moment became bigger than a single clip that IT turned into a reminder, one that many officials would rather the public forget, that oversight is not optional. It's not mean-spirited. It's not partisan theater. It is necessary, painfully necessary, especially when the decisions in question affect real lives, families, and communities. Because if someone is willing to use force quickly when dealing with a puppy, how do they approach complex human crises? If someone views killing a goat as another unpleasant job, how do they view responsibility? If someone can recount those moments casually, what other moments do they recount casually behind closed doors? These aren't accusations. These are questions. Reasonable, human questions that any voter, any parent, any lawmaker would naturally ask. But they are also questions that make people squirm. And that's the exact reason the clip resonated so widely online. It wasn't about politics. It was about instinct, judgment, power. The traits we hope leaders possess and the red flags we fear they might hide. Once the public saw lawmakers sitting in stunned silence while listening to a story they could barely stomach, the narrative shifted permanently. No matter what party anyone belongs to, no matter what side of the aisle they feel closest to, this moment forced a rare type of honesty. Leadership is not just about what someone fights for, but it's about what they choose to do when no one is watching. And even more important, it's about what they consider no big deal. Because anyone can present a polished image in front of cameras. Anyone can deliver speeches full of patriotism and discipline. But the gravel pit moment revealed something raw, something unfiltered, something that can't be explained away. And once that truth is revealed, there's no going back. That's why this story matters. That's why Congress reacted the way it did. That's why the clip continues to ricochet across the internet. Because people aren't just responding to animal cruelty. They're responding to character. They're responding to instinct. They're responding to the quiet, unspoken fear that someone who treats living beings like disposable inconveniences might carry that same instinct into positions of far greater authority. In a world where power can be abused silently, stories like this force us to pay attention. Oversight becomes essential. Truth becomes uncomfortably bright. And leadership becomes a responsibility, not a performance. That if you want more deep dive commentary that cuts through the noise, unpacks the real meaning behind these political moments, and exposes what powerful people hope you don't notice, make sure you subscribe, like the video, and turn on notifications. We break down the stories others avoid, because understanding the people making decisions over your life shouldn't depend on spin. It should depend on clarity. And this moment is exactly why that clarity matters.